Rain pounded the windshield as her fingers went numb around the chain binding her wrist to the door. Hours had passed since headlights first appeared and disappeared into the storm, each one a flicker of hope crushed by silence. She had stopped screaming, stopped hoping. Then, through the downpour, a single motorcycle slowed. A man in leather stepped into the rain, and for the first time in 6 hours, she wasn't invisible. What he found chained to that car would expose a secret her own family tried to bury, and change everything this town thought it knew about the men riding through it. Rain had been falling over Cedar Falls for 3 days straight, turning the gravel shoulders of Route 9 into rivers of mud. Walter Coleman had ridden through worse storms in his 56 years, but something about this one made the hair on his neck stand up before he even saw the car. He was the president of the Iron Wolves, a small motorcycle club that met every Thursday night in the back room of a diner that barely tolerated their presence. Most of Cedar Falls saw them as trouble waiting to happen. Grown men on loud machines, leather vests, the kind of people mothers warned their daughters about. Walter had stopped trying to change that opinion years ago. He simply lived his life, fixed motorcycles for a living, and kept his club close. That night, Walter was riding home from the garage when his headlight caught something wrong at the edge of the road. A car, an old sedan, pulled halfway into the ditch. The kind of car nobody drove anymore, unless they had no choice. He almost passed it. Almost. Instinct made him stop. The rain was hammering the roof of the vehicle when he approached, and for a moment he thought the car was empty. Then he saw her, a small, frail woman in the passenger seat, soaked through despite the windows being shut, her wrist bound to the door handle with a rusted length of chain and a padlock. "Ma'am?" Walter's voice cracked with disbelief. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, pale blue, clouded with pain and exhaustion. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Walter didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out his phone and called Doc, Jerry Coyle, his vice president, a former Army paramedic who'd patched up more roadside emergencies than anyone Walter knew. "Doc, I need you at the old mile marker on Route 9, now, and bring bolt cutters." Within 15 minutes, 3 motorcycles pulled up behind Walter's, headlights cutting through the downpour. Jerry Coyle didn't ask questions. He went straight to work, prying at the padlock with steady hands, while Pete Donahue held an old tarp over the woman to shield her from the rain, and Sam Whitlock, the youngest of the group, ran back to his bike for a blanket. "She's got a pulse, but it's weak," Jerry said, checking her wrist where the chain had rubbed the skin raw. "Hypothermia setting in. We need to move her." "Ambulance is 20 minutes out in this weather," Walter said, glancing at his phone. "We don't have 20 minutes. They didn't wait. Walter wrapped her gently in his own leather jacket, careful of what looked like a fractured arm, and the 4 men carried her to Pete's truck, which had followed behind on the ride home. They drove straight to Cedar Falls General, hazard lights blinking through sheets of rain. At the hospital, Nurse Susan Prescott met them at the entrance, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she took in the scene. 4 leather-clad bikers soaked to the bone, cradling an elderly woman between them. "What happened to her?" Susan asked, already waving for a gurney. "Found her chained in a car on Route 9, Walter said. "Chained, Susan. Somebody left her there." The words hung in the air. Susan's eyes moved from the woman's bruised wrist to the 4 men who had brought her in, and for the first time, something other than judgment crossed her face. Sheriff Roy Bannister arrived 20 minutes later, shaking rain from his hat as he stepped into the emergency room. He'd known Walter for over a decade, mostly through noise complaints and the occasional bar fight that never actually involved the Iron Wolves, though people always assumed it did. "Coleman," Roy said, arms crossed. "You want to tell me why I'm getting a call about you and your boys hauling in an unconscious woman?" "She was chained to a car door, Roy, in the rain. We didn't do this. We found her." Roy's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough stories about the Iron Wolves over the years to have his doubts, but the look in Walter's eyes wasn't the look of a guilty man. It was something closer to fury. "I need statements from all of you," Roy said finally, "and I need to know who she is." It took hours before they identified her. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, 74 years old, a widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Her son, Kevin Marsh, lived 2 counties over and hadn't visited in over a year. When Eleanor finally regained consciousness the next morning, the first face she saw wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was Walter sitting in a chair at the edge of her hospital room, still in his damp leather vest, waiting. "You're the one," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You found me." "We did," Walter said. "You're safe now." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed it. Eleanor's recovery was slow. Her body had suffered from exposure, a fractured wrist, and a dislocated shoulder from struggling against the chain. But it was the silence that worried Susan Prescott most. Eleanor wouldn't speak about how she ended up on Route 9, no matter how gently she was asked. Walter visited every day. At first, it was out of concern, a need to see that the woman he'd pulled from the ditch was truly recovering. But as the days passed, something else took root, a sense of responsibility he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. "You don't have to keep coming," Eleanor told him on his 4th visit, though her tone carried no real objection. "I know," Walter said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "But somebody chained you to a car door and left you in a storm. I'd like to know why, and I don't think you're ready to tell the sheriff." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly against the blanket. "It was my son," she finally admitted. "Kevin. He said I was becoming too much trouble, too expensive. He said the home he found for me was full, so he left me in the car until he figured out what to do with me." Walter's jaw clenched, a slow burning anger rising in his chest. "He left you to die." "He said he'd come back," Eleanor whispered. "He didn't." That afternoon, Sheriff Bannister opened an official investigation into Kevin Marsh. When Deputy Nathan Cross tracked him down 2 counties over, Kevin claimed his mother had wandered off on her own, that the chain was for her safety, to keep her from leaving the car in her confused state. It was a lie so thin even Nathan, the youngest and most trusting officer on the force, saw through it immediately. Meanwhile, word had spread through Cedar Falls about what the Iron Wolves had done. Reactions were mixed. Some residents softened, murmuring quiet gratitude at the diner counter. Others remained suspicious, certain the bikers had some ulterior motive, attention, sympathy, maybe even a payout from a grateful old woman. "They're just doing it for show," Roy overheard one man say at the gas station. "Wait till the news cameras leave. They'll go right back to being trouble." Walter heard the same whispers but refused to let them change his course. He organized the club to take turns visiting Eleanor, bringing her flowers, home-cooked meals from Pete's wife, and eventually small comforts from her own house. A shawl, a photograph of her late husband, a worn Bible she asked for by name, though she made clear she wasn't looking for a sermon, just something familiar. Jerry Coyle, still processing his own memories of assisting the wounded overseas, found himself drawn to Eleanor's quiet resilience. He spent hours simply sitting with her, checking her vitals long after his medical obligation had ended, talking about nothing in particular, the weather, old music, anything to keep her spirits up. But complications arose. Kevin Marsh, feeling the walls close in, hired a lawyer and began spreading rumors that Eleanor's memory was unreliable, that she'd fabricated the story out of confusion, or, worse, that the bikers had coached her into blaming him to avoid liability for their own actions on the road that night. Susan Prescott, now firmly on Eleanor's side, grew furious watching the narrative twist. "He's trying to make her look crazy," she told Walter one evening in the hospital hallway. "If this goes to a hearing, they'll use her age against her. Then we make sure she's not alone when it does," Walter said. The Iron Wolves, once dismissed as troublemakers, began showing up not just at Eleanor's bedside, but at town meetings, at the courthouse steps, offering statements, refusing to let the story be buried. Slowly, the town's judgment began to crack under the weight of what they were witnessing. Men once feared were the only ones fighting for a woman everyone else had overlooked. 3 weeks after Eleanor was found, the hearing to determine Kevin Marsh's culpability was scheduled at the Cedar Falls courthouse. Eleanor, though physically healing, grew anxious as the date approached. She confided in Walter one quiet evening that she feared no one would believe her, not against her own son, a man with a steady job and a clean record on paper. People believe families protect their own, Eleanor said, but he only protected himself. Walter sat with that truth heavier than he expected. He thought of his own estranged relationship with his daughter, a wound he rarely spoke of even to his closest friends in the club. He understood, more than Eleanor knew, what it meant to be failed by blood. Doubt crept into the club as well. Pete Donahue, usually steady and unshaken, voiced what others were afraid to say aloud. "We're not lawyers, Walter. We're not doctors. What if we push too hard and it backfires on her? What if the judge sees a bunch of bikers surrounding an old woman and thinks we're the ones manipulating her?" It was a fair concern, and Walter carried it with him through sleepless nights. The town's suspicion hadn't disappeared. If anything, Kevin's lawyer had stoked it, painting the Iron Wolves as opportunists capitalizing on a vulnerable woman's tragedy for their own image. Sheriff Bannister, once skeptical of Walter's intentions, found himself now defending the club in ways he hadn't expected. At a town hall meeting, when a resident accused the bikers of using Eleanor for publicity, Roy stood and spoke plainly. "I've known Walter Coleman for 11 years, Roy said. "I've never liked his crowd, and I've told him as much to his face, but I was there the night they found her. Nobody fakes carrying a half-frozen woman through a storm because they want attention. They did what none of us did. They stopped." The room fell silent, and for the first time the tide of public opinion began to shift, even if reluctantly. Still, the days leading up to the hearing tested everyone. Eleanor suffered a minor setback, her blood pressure spiking under the stress, forcing a brief hospital readmission. Susan Prescott stayed by her side around the clock, while Jerry Coyle monitored her condition with the same careful diligence he'd once given soldiers in far more dangerous circumstances. Kevin Marsh, sensing the momentum turning against him, attempted one last manipulation. A visit to Eleanor's hospital room, alone, hoping to convince her to drop the complaint before it reached the judge. "Mom, please," he said, his voice practiced and soft. "This is tearing the family apart. If you just tell them it was a misunderstanding, this all goes away." Eleanor, weaker in body but resolute in spirit, looked her son in the eyes for the first time since the storm. "You left me to freeze, Kevin. I loved you your whole life, and you left me in the rain like I was garbage." Kevin left without another word, and Walter, standing quietly in the doorway where he'd been keeping watch, said nothing. He didn't need to. Eleanor had found her own strength, and that, more than anything the club had done, was the true turning point. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear. The storm that had defined Eleanor's ordeal, long since past. The Cedar Falls courthouse steps were lined not just with lawyers and reporters from a small regional news outlet, but with a dozen motorcycles parked in a neat row. The Iron Wolves present in full, standing quietly behind Eleanor as she was wheeled up the ramp in her chair. Inside, the hearing began with Kevin's lawyer presenting his case, that Eleanor's account was unreliable, colored by age and possible confusion, and that the chain had been a misguided but well-intentioned safety measure for a mother prone to wandering. Then Eleanor spoke. Her voice, though frail, carried steadily across the courtroom. She described the cold seeping into her bones, The way she'd called for help until her throat gave out, the terror of watching headlights pass again and again without stopping. She described the moment Walter's motorcycle finally slowed, how she thought, in her delirium, that she was imagining a rescue that would never come. "I am not confused about being left to die," she said. "I remember every second of it." Nathan Cross took the stand next, presenting the padlock and chain as evidence, along with phone records showing Kevin had ignored 3 calls from a concerned neighbor who noticed the car parked in the same spot for over 6 hours before Walter found her. Then, unexpectedly, Susan Prescott addressed the court, describing Eleanor's physical condition upon arrival: hypothermia, a fractured wrist consistent with someone straining against a restraint, and bruising that matched prolonged immobilization, not an accidental fall. Walter was called to testify last. He kept his statement simple, refusing to embellish or perform for the room. "I've been riding these roads for 30 years, he said. "I've seen broken-down cars, drunk drivers, deer in the headlights. I've never seen anything like what we found that night. A woman left to die in the rain because taking care of her was inconvenient." The judge, visibly moved, called for a brief recess before delivering the ruling. When court resumed, the verdict came swiftly. Kevin Marsh was found guilty of elder neglect and abandonment, stripped of any guardianship claims, and ordered to pay restitution for Eleanor's medical expenses. He would face separate criminal charges in the following weeks. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Eleanor as she was wheeled into the sunlight. A local news anchor, who had initially covered the story with a skeptical angle, questioning the biker's motives, now asked Eleanor directly what she wanted the town to know. Eleanor looked past the cameras, toward Walter and the club standing behind her. Men the town had feared and dismissed for years. "I want them to know," she said, "that the people I thought would protect me left me to die, and the people this town warned me about saved my life and never asked for anything in return." The words spread through Cedar Falls faster than the storm ever had. In the months that followed, Cedar Falls slowly began to change. Not all at once, not without lingering skepticism from a few stubborn holdouts, but enough that the shift was undeniable. The diner that once tolerated the Iron Wolves' Thursday meetings began setting aside their favorite booth without being asked. Susan Prescott made a habit of stopping by the garage with coffee on her days off, no longer a nurse observing patients from a professional distance, but a friend. Eleanor, once alone in her house at the edge of town, was rarely without company now. Jerry Coyle visited twice a week to check on her recovering wrist and shoulder, though the visits had long since stopped being purely medical. He'd taught her how to play cards the way soldiers did in the barracks, and she'd taught him her late husband's recipe for peach cobbler, insisting he write it down properly instead of trying to memorize it like a stubborn man. Pete Donahue and his wife took to inviting Eleanor for Sunday dinners, and Sam Whitlock, the youngest member of the club, found himself unofficially adopted as the grandson she'd never had, mowing her lawn every other week and refusing payment no matter how she insisted. Walter visited most of all. Their friendship had become something neither of them expected. An old widow and an aging biker, both carrying wounds from family who had let them down, finding in each other a steadiness that made the losses easier to bear. Walter eventually reconnected with his own estranged daughter, inspired in part by watching Eleanor's courage to speak difficult truths aloud. It wasn't a perfect reunion, but it was a beginning, and Walter credited Eleanor for giving him the nerve to try. Sheriff Bannister, once the club's most vocal skeptic, became an unlikely ally, occasionally stopping by the garage just to talk, no longer treating the Iron Wolves as a problem waiting to happen, but as men who had proven, when it mattered most, exactly who they were. Kevin Marsh's case moved through the courts quietly, his punishment less important to Eleanor than the fact that she had finally been believed. She didn't seek revenge. She sought only the truth, And once it was spoken aloud in that courtroom, she found she could finally let go of the anger that had been chaining her long before that night on Route 9. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, the Iron Wolves organized a small gathering at the same mile marker where they had found her. Eleanor, walking now with only a cane for support, stood at the spot where her life had nearly ended and had, in the strangest way, truly begun again. "You didn't just save my life that night," she told Walter, the club gathered quietly around them. "You gave this town a reason to see people differently, including me." Walter, never one for long speeches, simply nodded and helped her back into the car. This time her own, unchained and headed home. The town of Cedar Falls had learned something that year that no lecture or sermon could have taught them, that judgment often blinds people to who truly deserves trust, and that sometimes the ones you fear the most are the ones who show up when everyone else walks away.